An older man rushed into a clinic with a large splinter buried deep in his hand. The doctor examined it and said, "I'm going to numb your hand before I remove it." The man quickly shook his head. "No thanks, document. Just pull it out." The doctor looked surprised. "Trust me, this is going to hurt a lot without any numbing medicine." The man smiled. "I've already survived the 2 worst pains a person can ever feel. I can handle this." The doctor warned him one more time. "Are you absolutely sure? Go ahead." The doctor grabbed the splinter with a pair of tweezers and pulled. The man let out a scream so loud it echoed through the entire clinic. A few moments later, the doctor finished removing it. "There," he said. "It's over." Still catching his breath, the man nodded. "I told you. I've been through much worse." Now the doctor was curious. "Worse than that? What could possibly be worse?" The man replied. "One time I was hiking in the mountains and stopped behind a tree because nature was calling. I accidentally sat down on a giant steel animal trap." The doctor winced. "I don't even want to imagine how painful that must have been. That has to be the worst pain of your life." The man shook his head. "Nope. It was only the second worst." The doctor blinked. "What could possibly have been worse than sitting on an animal trap?" The man smiled and said, "When I reached the end of the chain." 3 travelers were hiking together when they reached the base of a huge mountain. They all needed to get to the other side, but the cliffs were steep and there didn't seem to be any way across. The first traveler looked up at the mountain and prayed, "Please give me the strength to get over this mountain." In an instant, he became incredibly strong. Using his strength, he climbed the rocky cliffs and reached the other side after several exhausting hours. The second traveler prayed, "Please give me the strength and the skill to get over this mountain." Immediately, he was given climbing gear and the knowledge to use it. He carefully climbed the mountain and made it across a little faster. The third traveler watched both of them and thought for a moment. Then he prayed, "Please give me the strength, the skill, and the wisdom to get to the other side." Poof! He turned into a local tour guide and took the tunnel that went straight through the mountain. 3 explorers were traveling across a vast desert when they came to a deep canyon. They needed to reach the other side, but there didn't seem to be any safe way across. The first explorer looked up and prayed, "Please give me the strength to cross this canyon." In an instant, he became incredibly strong. He climbed down one side, struggled across the rocks below, and climbed back up the other side. It took him nearly 3 hours, but he made it. The second explorer prayed, "Please give me the strength and the ability to cross this canyon." Immediately, he found the knowledge and tools to build a sturdy rope bridge. After a couple of hours of hard work, he crossed safely. The third explorer watched both of them carefully. Then he smiled and prayed, "Please give me the strength, the ability, and the wisdom to get to the other side." Poof! He turned into a park ranger and used the pedestrian bridge just a few hundred yards down the trail. One Saturday morning, a man signed up for a fishing class at the local lake. When he arrived, he discovered that he was the only student who had shown up. The instructor smiled and asked, "Since it's just the 2 of us, would you still like me to teach today's lesson?" The man shrugged. "I'm no expert, but if I went fishing and only 1 fish showed up, I'd still try to catch it." The instructor took that as encouragement. He launched into the lesson. He explained every kind of fishing rod, every type of bait, every knot, every casting technique, and every fishing story he had collected over 40 years. 1 hour passed. Then 2. Then nearly 3. Finally, the instructor finished and proudly asked, "So, what did you think of the lesson?" The man smiled politely. "Well, I'm no expert. But if only 1 fish showed up, I sure wouldn't dump the whole bucket of bait in the water." A tourist visited a wildlife park where a trainer was showing off an amazing parrot. The trainer proudly announced, This parrot can look at anyone and tell their exact age. The tourist laughed. There's no way that's real. To prove it, the trainer pointed to a little girl. The parrot flapped its wings and squawked. 8. The girl's parents smiled. That's right. The trainer tried a few more volunteers. Each time, the parrot called out a number, and each person confirmed it was exactly correct. The tourist became even more skeptical. That bird is just guessing. The trainer smiled. Why don't we test it on you? Gladly, the tourist replied. The parrot hopped over, stared at him for a long moment. Then it turned around, lifted its tail, and let out the loudest, longest fart anyone had ever heard. The parrot turned back, looked the tourist in the eye, and squawked. 2. The tourist's jaw dropped. He shook his head in amazement and said, Unbelievable. 42. An old wizard had finally retired after a lifetime of adventures. At 80 years old, he spent his days relaxing in a quiet cottage with his faithful parrot, Jasper. One afternoon, a glowing spirit appeared in his garden. You've lived an honorable life, the spirit said. I'd like to grant you 3 wishes. The old wizard smiled. For my first wish, I'd like more wealth than I could ever spend. In an instant, his tiny cottage transformed into a magnificent mansion filled with treasures. The spirit nodded. And your second wish? The old wizard looked at his wrinkled hands. I'd like to be young again. With a flash of light, his gray hair disappeared, his back straightened, and he became a strong, handsome young man once more. He couldn't stop smiling. The spirit asked, And your final wish? The young wizard looked over at Jasper, who was perched quietly on the windowsill. I've always loved that old bird. Turn him into a brilliant young man so we can enjoy this new life together. Another flash of light. The parrot vanished. Standing in his place was an incredibly handsome young man. The spirit smiled. My work here is done. With that, the spirit disappeared. For a long moment, the two simply stared at each other. Then the young man walked over, leaned close to the wizard's ear, smiled, and whispered, I bet you regret having my wings clipped. 2 unemployed friends were sitting outside a cafe when one of them suddenly announced, I've decided to become a firefighter. His friend laughed. You? A firefighter? You don't know anything about fighting fires. Yes, I do. Really? Then answer this. What are you going to do when you arrive at a burning building and the flames are coming straight at you? I'll grab the big hose and spray the fire until it goes out. Okay, but what if the hose gets tangled and you can't use it? Then I'll grab the fire extinguisher and blast the flames. What if the extinguisher is empty? Then I'll use the emergency ladder and climb to the roof. What if the ladder breaks? Then I'll call for backup. What if your radio doesn't work? I'll grab a bucket and throw water on the fire. What if there isn't any water? The man looked at his friend like he was missing the obvious. You're not thinking clearly. What do you mean? If the hose gets tangled, the extinguisher is empty, the ladder breaks, the radio doesn't work, and there's no water. You can bet there'll be a fire truck somewhere nearby. A woman was looking for a little extra cash, so she decided to offer her services doing odd jobs around the neighborhood. She went door to door until she reached a huge house with a massive garden. She knocked, and the homeowner answered. Hello? I'm looking for some work. Is there anything around the house that needs doing? The man thought for a moment. Well, actually, yes. Do you know how to wash a car? Absolutely. Great. There's a bucket, soap, and everything you need in the garage. I'll pay you $15 if you do a good job. Deal, she said enthusiastically. She hurried off to get started. The man's wife had heard the conversation and looked at him suspiciously. Are you serious? That car is enormous. It'll take her forever to wash it for only $15. The man grinned. I know. About 20 minutes later, the doorbell rang. The woman stood there covered in soap and completely exhausted. All finished, she announced proudly. The man looked outside. His car was still completely dry. He frowned. Where's the car? She pointed toward the driveway. Oh, I had a little trouble finding it. The man looked confused. Then she added, By the way, that's not a car. It's a boat. For years, a man suffered from terrible back pain. He tried everything: physical therapy, massage, medication, even expensive specialists, but nothing helped. Finally, a friend recommended an elderly doctor who was famous for solving impossible cases. After a long examination, the doctor said, I believe I've found the problem. The man leaned forward eagerly. What is it? You've been wearing shoes that are 2 sizes too small. The man laughed. That's impossible. I've worn this size my whole adult life. The doctor shrugged. Keep wearing them if you like. But if you want the pain to stop, buy the correct size. The man was desperate enough to try. The very next day, he bought a comfortable new pair of shoes. Within hours, his back pain disappeared. Thrilled with his new life, he decided to celebrate by buying an entirely new wardrobe. He walked into an upscale clothing store. The salesman took one look at him. You're a size 42 jacket. He was exactly right. And those trousers should be a 34 waist. Perfect again. The man was impressed. Finally, he smiled and said, Let's see how good you really are. What size socks do I wear? The salesman looked him over and replied, Size 11. The man laughed. Nope. I've worn size 9 socks for years. The salesman smiled. Well, that explains the back pain. A woman was waiting in a hotel lobby when a young man nearby suddenly started smiling at her. She looked around, wondering what was so funny. A few minutes later, she moved to another chair. The young man smiled again. She moved once more. This time, he started laughing. Annoyed, she complained to the hotel manager. The manager asked the young man to explain himself. He said, Well, when she first sat down, she was right underneath a sign that said, Fresh coffee, wake up your senses. I smiled because she looked like she needed one. Then she moved underneath another sign that said, Relax, our beds are extra comfortable. That made me laugh. She moved again and sat directly beneath a sign that said, Need a little more room? By then, I was struggling not to laugh. The manager raised an eyebrow. So what finally made you lose it? The young man pointed toward the final sign she had sat beneath. It read, Please take a number, we're expecting a crowd. The manager shook his head and dismissed the complaint. One afternoon, a man was walking past his neighbor's garage when he noticed something very strange through the open door. His neighbor was standing in front of an old pickup truck. Slowly, he took off his work gloves. Then he dramatically removed his jacket. He unbuttoned his flannel shirt with exaggerated flair, tossed it onto a toolbox, and struck a pose like he was on a fashion runway. Completely bewildered, the man rushed into the garage. What in the world are you doing? His neighbor jumped in surprise. You nearly gave me a heart attack. Well? The man asked. Why are you putting on a fashion show for your truck? The neighbor sighed. My wife and I have been seeing a marriage counselor. And? He told me I needed to do something sexy to attract her. The man looked confused. So why are you doing it in front of a pickup truck? His neighbor shrugged and said, I thought he said, do something sexy to attract her. A man went to spend the weekend with his elderly uncle, who lived alone in a quiet farmhouse far from town. The next morning, his uncle prepared a huge breakfast of eggs, toast, and sausage. The man noticed something suspicious on his plate. Uncle, are these dishes clean? His uncle nodded confidently. Of course. They're as clean as fresh mountain water. Now eat your breakfast. The man wasn't completely convinced, but he finished his meal. At lunchtime, His uncle served homemade sandwiches on the same plates. Again, the man noticed little crumbs and dried food stuck around the edges. Are you absolutely sure these plates are clean? His uncle didn't even look up. I told you already. They're as clean as fresh mountain water. Now stop asking. That evening, the man packed his bags and headed toward the front door. Suddenly, the uncle's huge dog stepped in front of him and began growling. The man called out, "Uncle! Your dog won't let me leave!" Without taking his eyes off the television, the old man shouted, "Mountain water! Come here!" A retired firefighter attended an awards banquet for emergency workers. During the evening, a cheerful young paramedic struck up a conversation with him. "You seem so serious," she said. "Are you enjoying yourself?" He nodded. "I am. I'm just not much of a talker." She noticed the medals on his jacket. "You must have had quite a career. I've seen a few exciting days." She smiled. "You should relax more. Life's too short to be this serious." He simply nodded. Trying to keep the conversation going, she asked, "So, when was the last time you went on a date?" The old firefighter glanced at his watch. 2025. Her eyes widened. 2025? No wonder you look so lonely. You need to get back out there. Feeling sorry for him, she invited him to the dance floor. They danced together for quite a while, laughed, and had a wonderful time. When the music finally stopped, she smiled and said, "Well, you certainly haven't forgotten how to have fun since 2025. The old firefighter looked down at his watch and replied, "I should hope not. It's only 9:30. This morning I was beaten up by a busted woman in an elevator. I was staring at boobs and she said, 'Press 1, please.' So I did. I don't remember much after that." A tourist visiting a big city wandered into an exclusive luxury car dealership. A friendly saleswoman greeted him and invited him to look around. They chatted for a while, joked, and she began showing him the newest sports cars. The tourist leaned over and quietly asked her a question. She looked shocked. "I'm sorry, sir, absolutely not." She excused herself and walked away. Thinking there had been some misunderstanding, the sales manager sent over a more experienced salesperson. Again, they chatted, laughed, and looked over several expensive cars. The tourist leaned in and whispered the same question. The salesperson shook his head. No chance. He walked away as well. Now the dealership manager became curious. He had been selling luxury cars for 30 years and couldn't imagine what this ordinary-looking customer kept asking that made every salesperson refuse. So he decided to handle the customer himself. He introduced himself, spent a few minutes talking about the cars, and finally asked, "So, what exactly is it that you're looking for?" The tourist smiled, leaned forward, and whispered, "Can I pay with Monopoly money?" A struggling traveler was walking along a quiet country road when a masked man suddenly stepped out from behind a tree. "Halt!" the masked man shouted. "I'm the famous highway robber. I take money from travelers and give it to people who need it." The traveler raised his hands. "Please, sir, I don't have anything. I've been broke for years." The robber thought for a moment. "Well, in that case, you clearly need this more than I do." He handed the traveler a heavy bag filled with gold coins and disappeared into the woods. The traveler stared at the bag in disbelief. "Unbelievable! I'm rich! I can finally afford anything I want." Suddenly, the masked man jumped back out from behind the tree. "Halt!" The traveler froze. The robber pointed at him and said, "Now that you're rich, give me all your money." A hamster that had spent its entire life in a pet research center finally found a way to escape. The moment it squeezed through a hole in the fence, it felt soft grass beneath its feet and breathed fresh air for the very first time. "This is amazing," it thought. Not long afterward, it wandered into a nearby meadow where it met a whole family of wild hamsters. "Where did you come from?" one of them asked. I've lived in a laboratory my whole life, the little hamster replied. I just escaped. Well, welcome, they said. Come explore with us. The first thing they showed him was a field full of ripe sunflower seeds. He had never tasted anything so delicious. After they finished eating, one of the wild hamsters said, Come on, we'll show you something even better. They led him to a nearby orchard where fallen apples covered the ground. The little hamster spent the next hour eating fresh fruit until he could barely move. What else do you do around here? He asked. One of the others smiled. See that giant exercise wheel inside the old barn? The hamster's eyes lit up. A real wheel? Oh yes, they said. We run on it whenever we want. The little hamster spent the rest of the afternoon racing around the wheel, happier than he'd ever been. As the sun began to set, the wild hamsters asked, So, are you going to stay here with us? The little hamster smiled. I've had the best day of my life. But I really have to get back to the laboratory. The others stared at him. Why would you ever go back? The hamster shrugged and said, They're probably wondering where their wheel went. A newlywed couple had just moved into their first home when the wife's mother came to visit. She immediately wanted to inspect everything. While touring the backyard, they walked past the garage when the family's old tractor suddenly lurched forward, rolled over a pile of equipment, and knocked the mother-in-law unconscious. Sadly, she didn't survive. At the funeral a few days later, the husband stood beside the casket, greeting everyone who came to pay their respects. The pastor noticed something strange. Whenever a woman approached and whispered something to the grieving husband, he nodded sadly and replied, Yes, it was. But whenever a man whispered something to him, he shook his head and answered, No, I can't. The pastor became curious and later asked, I noticed that the women said something and you always agreed, but the men asked you something and you always refused. What were they saying? The husband sighed. The women were saying, What a terrible tragedy. And I said, Yes, it was. The pastor nodded. And the men? The husband shook his head. They kept asking, You want to sell that tractor? A man walked into a popular pizza restaurant and ordered the last slice of the house's famous deep dish pizza. Just as the waiter placed it on the table, he returned looking nervous. Sir, I'm terribly sorry, but there's been a mix-up. The sheriff over there orders that last slice every Friday, and we accidentally served it to you. The man folded his arms. Well, you served it to me, so I'm keeping it. The waiter apologized and walked away. A moment later, the sheriff stood up and came over to the table. He looked the man straight in the eye and said, Listen carefully. That pizza is mine. The man didn't respond. The sheriff continued, And whatever you do to that pizza, I'm going to do to you. If you tear off a piece, I'll tear off one of yours. If you crush it, I'll do the same to you. The restaurant fell silent. The man looked down at the pizza for a long moment. Then he slowly picked it up, licked the entire top of it from one end to the other, set it back on the plate, smiled, and slid it across the table. Enjoy. A small company was hiring for an office assistant. A sign on the front door read, Help wanted. Must be able to type, no computers, and speak 2 languages. Equal opportunity employer. One morning, a cat walked through the front door. It approached the receptionist, sat down politely, and pointed at the sign with its paw. The receptionist called the manager. The manager stared at the cat. You can't possibly be here for the job. The cat jumped onto a chair and nodded. Well, the sign says you must be able to type. The cat walked over to the keyboard and typed a perfectly formatted letter. The manager's jaw dropped. Fine. But you also need to know how to use a computer. The cat sat at the computer and quickly opened several programs, created a spreadsheet, organized files, and even sent an email. The manager was completely amazed. You're incredibly talented, but I still can't hire you. The cat jumped down and walked over to the sign. It placed one paw directly on the words, "Equal Opportunity Employer." The manager sighed. "Yes, I know. But you also have to be bilingual." The cat looked directly at him and calmly said, "Meow." A man had been driving for hours and was exhausted, so when he reached the next town, he pulled into a quiet-looking parking area to take a quick nap. He had barely closed his eyes when... Knock, knock! He looked out the window and saw a cyclist stopped beside the car. "Excuse me, sir, do you know what time it is?" The man checked his dashboard clock. 7:20. "Thanks," the cyclist said and rode away. The man sighed and closed his eyes again. A few minutes later. Knock, knock! Another cyclist was standing beside the window. "Sorry to bother you, but do you have the time?" 7:30. "Thank you." The man was getting annoyed. He knew this was a popular cycling route, and more cyclists would probably keep stopping to ask. So he came up with a clever solution. He grabbed a piece of cardboard and wrote, "I don't know what time it is." He placed it in the windshield and settled back for his nap. A few minutes later. Knock, knock! The man opened his eyes. A cyclist stood outside, pointing toward the sign. "Sir! Sir!" "What?" The cyclist smiled and said, "It's 7:45. A professional car detailer and an auto mechanic met at a classic car exhibition. They got along so well that they decided to have lunch together. Before they sat down to eat, the detailer excused herself to wash her hands. After lunch, she washed them again before they left. That evening, they met at the mechanic's workshop to continue talking. As soon as she arrived, she asked if she could use the sink to wash her hands. A little later, they decided to inspect a vintage sports car the mechanic had been restoring. On the way over, she stopped once more to wash her hands. They spent quite a while working around the car together. When they finished, she quietly disappeared to wash her hands yet again. As she returned, the mechanic smiled and said, "I'd bet you're a professional car detailer." She laughed. "I am." "How did you know?" he replied. "Because you've washed your hands every chance you've had." She grinned. "Well then, I'd bet you're a body shop painter." The mechanic looked surprised. "That's right." "How did you figure that out?" She smiled and said, "Because I didn't get a speck of paint on me." A company manager didn't want to hire a man named Charlie, so he came up with a few tricky questions, hoping Charlie would fail the interview. The manager smiled and said, "First question. Without using any numbers, show me the number 9. Charlie didn't hesitate. He grabbed a pencil and drew 3 cats. The manager frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" Charlie smiled. "Cat, cat, cat." The manager sighed. "Fair enough. Second question. Same rule. Show me 99. Charlie thought for a moment. Then he drew whiskers on all 3 cats. The manager looked puzzled. "How does that mean 99? Charlie replied. "They're hairy cats now. Hairy cat, hairy cat, hairy cat." The manager rubbed his temples. He was running out of ideas. "All right," he said. "Last question. Without using any numbers, show me 100. Charlie studied his drawing, then added a tiny mouse beside each cat. "There." The manager looked completely confused. "I give up." "Explain." Charlie pointed at the picture. "Now you've got hairy cat and a mouse, hairy cat and a mouse, hairy cat and a mouse." He folded his arms, smiled, and asked, "So, when do I start?"